Hello, good morning if you are in the European time zone. We are happy to start this side event at the COP26 on CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's one regulation out of many, 14, which make the Fit for 55 package, but it is one of the most discussed at the global and international level for obvious reasons. And we are very happy to have this side event today in Glasgow, starting with welcoming Frans Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the European Commission. And I guess that you will make the case for your proposal, and as you know, you can count on a very wide and strong support from the European Parliament on this part of the package. I also welcome other speakers, and I try to find again my notes here. Sorry for that. Michael Melling from the MIT. We have Sam van den Plas from Carbon Market Watch, and Susanne Droge from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. For material reasons, I will have to leave, and the moderation will be made by Peter Liese in the coming minutes. So let's start without delaying too much, even if you might hear some noise because still people are entering the room. So now, thank you, Frans, to give you our keynote speech on CBAM.
Thank you very much, Pascal. It is a pleasure to talk about this issue. It's not the first time I talk about the issue, because it's one of the most debated issues in the international scene over the last year and a half, 2 years. If we are going to do what we promised, or what we're legally obliged to do in the European Union, which is to reach climate neutrality in 2050 and to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions with at least 55% between now and 2030, we need to really change many of our policies. But at the end, the core of any policy to decarbonize your economy is to put a price on carbon. So one of the most powerful and effective tools we have to bring down emissions in Europe is our emissions trading system. The principle is very simple, as you know. We put a price on CO2 emissions, we create a strong price signal for green investments, and we spur the market to develop cost-efficient solutions. At the same time, the revenues generated by the system can be used to address social impacts or to finance innovation. We know that carbon pricing works. The system currently covers 45% of all EU emissions and applies to around 10,000 installations in the power sector and manufacturing industry, as well as to over 500 airlines. Since its introduction in 2005, emissions from the ETS sectors have been cut by around 43%, and some of us will remember that when we voted the ETS system back then, there was a lot of resistance. Initial years, there was a lot of skepticism, even a lot of criticism. It didn't work, the price was too low, but I don't think that applies any longer. I think it's making school, because besides the European system, Canada, China, also Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, Switzerland, and parts of the United States are either operating or developing their own systems. Under the Green Deal, we want to revise and strengthen the system. We will also want to extend it to new sectors, because the ETS has proven itself to be effective as a tool for reducing emissions. And in some non-ETS sectors, we've not had the same level of success so far. Just to mention transport, where emissions are still going up instead of down. We will apply a new emissions trading system domestically for road transport and building fuels, as we need to make emissions cuts in those areas. And let me be very clear, especially in the presence of members of the European Parliament also, we believe this system could work. The goal is to reduce emissions and to create more energy efficient buildings. If there are alternatives that will lead to the same result, we will certainly study them. We're not tying our fate to an ETS system, but in all our analysis, the ETS system gives us the best result and gives us the best opportunity to compensate our citizens for potentially higher energy prices. Potentially, I say, because the onus will be on the producers of the energy first and foremost, and to avoid the trap of energy poverty. I believe, especially with the creation of the Climate Social Fund, we made a proposal. I mean, I know that in the European Parliament there are differing views on whether it's enough or not, whether it should be bigger or different. That's all up for debate, but the principle, I think, stands that if you create an energy transition, you have to make sure this is a just transition, that you leave no one behind, and that we understand that certain groups in society will be more vulnerable than others, and we need to address that vulnerability and make sure it doesn't happen. We also made, on the 14th of July, on 14 juillet, a range of measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from maritime transport. Of course, we want global action, but we believe that in the International Maritime Organization, not enough was achieved over the last periods, and we need to achieve more and do a lot better. And I hope, if I see the momentum here at COP, I hope that the IMO and other international organizations, also in aviation, understand the time is now to change their attitude and to work towards putting a fair price on carbon to decarbonize their industry. So by taking responsibility for half of the emissions from extra EU voyages, the EU would take responsibility for its fair share of shipping emissions and would encourage third countries to decide an appropriate action to address their share of emissions, that's the other 50%, or to support the development of appropriate global pricing schemes. I believe putting a price on carbon and having a thorough discussion with the maritime sector. Some of the dirtiest stuff available on Earth is burnt in ships to keep them going, whereas there are alternatives. You can, with renewables, the first projects are very promising that you can use, for instance, ammonia, green ammonia, to power shipping. I mean, these are the things we need to work for, and by putting a price on carbon, you make the business case for alternatives more interesting. So, one of the key priorities we have identified is in our sustainable and smart mobility strategy is to advance discussions on mid and long-term measures to ensure the swift implementation of the International Maritime Organization's initial greenhouse gas strategy. Now, on aviation, I want to say a few things. We need a stronger contribution from the aviation sector to reach our climate targets. Aviation emissions in Europe increased an average of 5% year on between 2013 and 2018. That's 5% every year. Well, there has been a recent reduction in air traffic, but that's completely COVID-related and not because of different policies, because now emissions are projected to grow again. So we have a serious challenge. That's why we propose to revise the ETS aviation rules to create an effective price signal and ensure that the sector contributes its fair share. Flights within the European Economic Area, as well as flights to Switzerland and the UK, will continue to be covered by the EU ETS. The total number of aviation allowances in the ETS will be capped at current levels and be reduced annually by 4.2%. Well, there's many other things we need to do, but I want to move quickly to CBAM, because that was also something that Pascal announced. Now, if you put a price on carbon, and that's what everybody who is going to decarbonize is going to do, you run the risk of carbon leakage. It's as simple as 1 and 1 is 2. So all nations moving in that direction will be faced with the potential of carbon leakage. And this is something we need to prevent. And the only reason for CBAM is to prevent carbon leakage. We wanted to be in conformity with WTO rules. We wanted to address this issue directly. We will use a trial period of 2 years where we see what the effects is in 5 sectors: cement, fertilizer, steel, aluminium, and electricity. And we will see what happens globally. Now, if a Turkish minister recently said, Turkey decided, one of the reasons why Turkey decided to sign and ratify the Paris Agreement is because we don't want CBAM to affect our trade with the EU, then CBAM is already working, even before it's been introduced. And if I talk to partners who initially said, we don't like CBAM, and I asked the question, but what about your carbon leakage risk? They all acknowledge they have it, and they will need to find ways of addressing it. And my point is this, and I said it also when I traveled to India and Indonesia. If we all move in the direction of decarbonizing our economy, of moving towards net zero, then we will all need to take comparable measures. Then the risk that CBAM will be applied in our trade is lower, unless this risk can be manifestly demonstrated. And if we do that, then I think we can introduce a system that is in conformity with WTO rules. And I have to say, the last couple of days, in speaking to many, many countries here, that logic now is widely understood. It's not always liked, but it's understood. And I think it's undeniable that the issue of carbon leakage will have to be addressed for decarbonizing efforts to actually be successful. So this is what I had to say on CBAM. And I hope we can continue our dialogue. And I'm actually quite confident that we will increasingly create a space across the planet where countries take comparable measures to decarbonize their economy, which would make the introduction of CBAM not necessary, or only in a very limited way. Thank you very much, Pascal.
Thank you. Thank you, Franz, and I will directly hand over the moderation of the panel to Peter Liese.
Yeah. Does it work? Yes, it works. So, thank you, Franz Timmermans, and thank you, Pascal, for starting this meeting. Maybe one question. We have a lady on our list, and we are not gender balanced at all, so at least the one lady should show up, and if she's not here, we should be informed about this. So, Susanne Dröge, is she around? Or? Remotely. She's remotely. So, that's great. So we will listen to you after the next speaker. Happy to see you at least on the screen.
Good, very good.
But the next speaker is Michael Mehling from the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We are very happy to have you here, one of the most important institutes in the world. And we would like to get your input. We spoke to the US delegation yesterday, and at least for me, it was a positive surprise that we were not immediately attacked for the CBAM. So there seems to be some openness, but your perspective would be interesting for us.
This is on as well. It's working good. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's of course an honor to be speaking here. And I was asked to provide sort of an outside perspective on specifically and especially the CBAM and how it's being received and discussed in other countries, including the country that I live in, the United States. And I want to echo, I think, what First Vice President Timmermans already said, that even before we had the regulation proposal released, the discussion of the introduction of a CBAM had already begun triggering effects in policy debates in a number of important trade partners of the EU. I've had the opportunity to have conversations with very senior decision makers along the eastern border of the EU, Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, but also along the southern border, for instance, Morocco, and also North America. And everywhere I see that this has accelerated discussion about domestic climate policy and the need to advance climate policies that would help show in a way that the industries in these countries are decarbonizing and hopefully would also be credited under the CBAM. Specifically to the United States, I think even here at COP26, it's been remarkable to talk and hear sort of the reactions from some influential and important stakeholders. Even if there are only a few here, for instance, the Republican congressional delegation, this resonated with them. And I'll just cite one poll that was recently conducted by the Climate Leadership Council. If you poll on carbon pricing, for instance, and the introduction of a carbon price in the United States, you will have the usual sort of the expected spectrum of responses from Democrats, those who self-identify as Democrats, independents, and Republicans, starting with 70–80% support on the left and declining to 40 or 30% on the right. If you, however, suggest that this price would be coupled with a penalty on imports from countries that have dirty industry and sell to the United States, and this would kind of level the playing field, it changes it completely. And you have almost unanimously 80% support for that kind of measure. And so I've heard very influential strategic actors who know very much the debate in the Beltway in Washington, D.C., that have turned to thinking that coupling trade and climate policy will be the absolute key and perhaps the only way to get bipartisan support for federal action on climate through legislation, including potentially with a carbon price. So that's the positive message. I really think that even just the discussion of CBAM has triggered action. A few hours ago, I was in an event with a Far East Asian trade partner, a very heavy export nation, also trying to show, we are trying to move forward with domestic climate policy and always mentioning the CBAM as one of the reasons they're doing so. But I would add something slightly more critical perhaps as well, and that is, although I know the European Commission has repeatedly stated that it is engaging with its trade partners and trying to explain and reach out to trade partners to ensure that there's understanding and also a cooperative approach to implementing CBAM, many of the people that I've talked to who are in government suggest that they still feel there's not enough discussion. And I would encourage accelerating and ramping up, scaling up this kind of outreach. And there's three issues that I think particularly stand out. First of all, I know that the proposal does not suggest excluding least developed countries from the scope of countries affected by the CBAM, so falling under the coverage of the CBAM. And I know the rationale of the European Commission in its impact assessment, why it suggests doing so. But I think that it will be probably discussed again. And I think especially if there are alternative ways to ensure that this is a just measure that takes into account the concerns of least developed countries, then those have to be communicated more transparently, more actively to build that kind of consensus. The second thing, as I mentioned, I was speaking to representatives of a Far East small nation, but a heavy exporter. And they were openly saying they're trying to accelerate their domestic carbon pricing discussion that's been ongoing for a decade. They are very worried that they will not be able to get the politics to line up by 2025, 2026, when the CBAM really kicks in. And so they're wondering, what does that mean? Will there be some recognition that they're on track? They're at least heading in the right direction, but they may not have an explicit carbon price yet. This is also important for the United States because despite those encouraging signals that I mentioned earlier, it still is important, I think, to be very cautiously optimistic about a federal carbon price. It is very well possible that we will not have one in the United States. And there are, of course, questions. What if the US does a lot on climate under the current and hopefully under future administrations, but it's not, due to the political economy, an explicit carbon price? And this could, of course, lead to tensions in a relationship that I think we want to protect, especially now. And the last point I would mention is then also confusion about how, for instance, the CBAM, with its recognition of an explicit carbon price, will then align with the recently announced US-EU joint statement on steel and aluminum, and sort of taking measures against non-market-oriented countries exporting steel and aluminum to the EU and to the United States. Clearly, it will have to somehow align with or enclose the CBAM as part of its operationalization. But if the US does not have a carbon price, how will that work? So again, I think there are some methodological and political questions that need to be resolved, but I'm sure we will see discussion about these. Thank you.
Can applaud also. Yeah, I think we can applaud also on this statement because it was showing where we have challenges, but also it was encouraging. Now we come to the lady in our round that is unfortunately only remotely with us, Susanne Dröge from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. I guess you are connected from Berlin.
Yes, hello to Glasgow. Thanks very much for inviting me, and I probably will echo what has been said by Michael Mehling, and I would like to elaborate a bit further on the issues we heard about our partners in the world. And first and foremost, of course, I fully agree that the global perspective on extension of the ETS is a very important one, and that the CBAM, of course, is not a unilateral project at all. it is tailor-made to match the ETS and be conform with what the EU is implementing so far in carbon pricing, but also when it comes to WTO rules that are framing this tool and should be doing so in order to prevent that trade partners start complaining and placing some formal complaints. I think that this has been successful so far, but I also think that this is a very risky undertaking to introduce the CBAM because it is hinging a lot on the political will. And this is what the COP is all about. Frans Timmermans has laid that out very nicely. And I think if there's a will in the countries we mainly talk about when we talk about the 4 sectors plus electricity here, when there's a will, there's a way. So I was wondering, is there a will and a way? And Michael Milling has started to talk about specific countries, and I see some kind of groups showing up here. And if the CBAM is an invitation to cooperate, which is the headline of this event today, I think we should start talking about the protectionist flavor it still has, despite the pronouncement of an anti-leakage purpose over again. Particular countries have protested from the early start against the CBAM, formally in WTO forums, bilaterally at high level. And basically, of course, because they deliver a lot of carbon-intensive stuff to the EU. I do not need to mention Russia. I do so nevertheless. While at the same time, the signals were very mixed, because also there were signals that they would try to circumvent the CBAM charges. They would consider pricing here and there to keep the money for themselves. So things got moved. While at the same time, we heard a lot from China in the phase where the proposal was not out yet, in the speculative phase of the CBAM drafting. Ever since, we do not hear much. I guess the partners are very reliable in the way they always try to understand and get through the details of the proposal and then start talking to the EU. I also would like to pronounce the cooperative things that show up everywhere, and I see the first grouping around cooperation when it comes to the issue of what to do with non-pricing of carbon regulation. That is, so carbon regulation, that means non-pricing, that means regulatory cost, and whether or not they will be credited. I think this is really a tough issue, because the EU has a regulation on top of carbon pricing, and that would, if you stick to the matter of fact, mean that the CBAM would even be need to be higher. But the US and the EU gave an example how to circumvent this issue for the time being. Michael Milling has mentioned this arrangement. I always call it the Green Steel deal, which is trying to bring down the protectionism that is still dominating the trade between the US and the EU. It has a real bad flavor, because it really exempts China from being a cooperative partner. I think this needs to be brought in line with the intention of the CBAM to be a cooperative tool. But bringing me back to the non-pricing tools, this is, of course, a way to mutually recognize what is being undertaken in both sides of the Atlantic to decarbonize the steel industry. Then, of course, the positive countries have been mentioned. Those are the ones that would really like to bring in their CO2 pricing, try much harder to increase their pricing system. There are Asian partners, not China, but others who are already, they have either a carbon price or it's in the making. So this is good news in order to cooperate here and probably to balance the bill at the border in favor of those suppliers. And the third group are the poor countries. Michael Milling mentioned the LDCs. I think we only have one country at the moment to deal with, actually, with aluminium supply. For them, there is a need for a solution. I think it is about more about the technical solutions that could make them cleaner, their production cleaner, and make them competitive in the EU markets. I think the whole CBAM outreach cannot go further or proceed without such bilateral talks when specific countries have specific issues. And that is where the Green Steel deal already gave an example. For diplomacy, my last point, I see the following topics on top of the list. I feel the CBAM needs much more explanation, although I feel myself, I talk 7 days a week about this and explain it to others, like all my colleagues who work on it do it as well. We have to clarify the data availability with our trade partners and verification burden and the crediting issue. And of course, the question is how many bilateral talks can the EU afford in terms of where is our resources and capacity to bring this forward. So working on the will and the way means keep in mind the differences in time dimensions. The short-term impacts are low because we have transition phase and then a phase-in of the CBAM. The long-term effects are pretty important because this would mean the CBAM is very successful because decarbonization comes forward, CO2 pricing comes forward, and it will bring down the CBAM to zero. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mrs. Dröge, for that, more critical intervention, but also for the conclusion that we need to reach out to third countries. And that's exactly the reason why we have this meeting here at the COP. From the European Parliament sides, we are committed to talk. And I would like to repeat the headline, CO2 pricing in the European Union, an invitation to the world. So not an instrument to block imports, but an invitation to the world. We will now have our last speaker, and Sam van der Plaas from Carbon Market Watch would rather focus on the two other parts of the Fit for 55 package where third countries are involved. That is maritime emissions, ETS, and the aviation sector. We worked a lot on these two issues and we suffered a lot because on maritime we didn't have anything in the European Union. And in aviation we wanted to bring our idea of decarbonization to the world, and partly we failed. So we need to do better now, but that also means that the spirit of Glasgow, that ambition is crucial and we all need to act now, it also needs to come to the aviation and the maritime sector. So Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Liese, and thank you very much to the European Parliament for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Speaking on behalf of Carbon Market Watch, we're an NGO focusing in Brussels on carbon pricing policies, climate policy, not only in the EU, but also here internationally. And I think it was said earlier, what we are discussing here today is only a small part of 14 legislative proposals, basically updating the European NDC from 40% to 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030. And we're not considering this in a vacuum, just to make that clear from the onset. And I think it does indeed include very important signals to the rest of the world. So I'll focus a bit on explaining how the EU specifically can build on this legislative momentum, because these are proposals. They can, and I think they should be strengthened. They will be considered by the co-legislators in the coming months and year, and also that international signals specifically can be strengthened. First, just a short notion on the overall 55% target, and speaking also in the name of European civil society here, this still falls short of meeting the objectives of the Paris Climate Agreement and specifically pursuing the efforts of staying below 1.5 degrees. It's important to repeat. I know in Brussels you're tired of hearing us saying this, but it's important to repeat here. I think we believe that target should be updated to 65% overall. So focusing on the topics of the discussion here today, and I will add a few words on the CBAM as well, if you allow me, just to start this off. Why we are doing this and why the European Union is doing this is basically implementing a principle which is in the European Treaty, which is a polluter pays principle. European Commission has a duty to uphold this, and we believe when you look under the hood of the legislative proposals, some of this falls short. It was mentioned earlier that the carbon border adjustment mechanism specifically is something to deal with the notion of carbon leakage, and thereby was announced as an alternative to the current measures under the EU ETS, which protect industries against carbon leakage. That's notably the free allocation of emission allowance under the European emissions trading system. And that's the point I wanted to touch upon, because it wasn't raised so prominently by the other speakers. We don't think that the current way in which the introduction of the CBAM and the very slow phase out of the free emission allowances, we don't think that's necessary. We think that could be done more rapidly. It could be done in a way that it creates a clear incentive to energy-intensive industries in the European Union, which basically, let's be honest, have not delivered significant greenhouse gas emission reductions in the past decade. When you look at the steel sector, chemicals, cement in the EU, emissions have been flatlining for almost a decade. Now, extending free issuance of these pollution permits, we don't think that can be considered a meaningful signal to the rest of the world. Basically, this would be allowed until 2035. That's still a very long time from today, and at the same time, we have an urgent crisis to deal with. I support the earlier remarks which were made on looking at fairness and equity components of the CBAM. Perhaps a way to look at this from the side of the European Parliament would be to focus on the revenue raising component of the story, which currently is dedicated to the EU's own resources, but we believe there should be a lot more space created that this can also go to least developed countries and help them in their efforts to decarbonize, build capacity, etc. Now, moving on to aviation and shipping sectors, which are painfully absent from the negotiations here outside of this room and further down the hallway in the UNFCCC process. We agree. Our patience with the International Aviation, Civil Aviation Organization, with the International Maritime Organization has indeed run out long ago. And I think it is important that what the European Union does and proposes is reasonable, it's responsible, price these carbon pollution from these sectors, because global measures are either inadequate looking at the aviation sector, or they're completely missing and won't get anywhere soon looking at the shipping sector. So good elements are there. I think there can be a bit more focus on also here for the aviation sector, look at a faster phase out of free emission allowances, at a broader scope coverage in the proposal. And for the shipping sector, I think a good aspect there is that there are no free emission allowances foreseen to go to that sector. But also here, full scope coverage would be, I think, the more responsible thing to do, on the condition that you can revert to 50-50 scope if other countries are also taking responsibility of their pollution. So let me conclude, and I think what we have here is a full suite of climate and energy policy tools, which, if they're well implemented, they do have a potential for the European Union to create a first mover advantage and inspire others to follow suit. So replying to the question here at hand, yes, this is an invitation to the rest of the world, but there is room to do more work and to also make sure that the rest of the world can actually see this as a sincere and a serious invitation, so that they will happily join that race towards global decarbonization, phase out of fossil fuels, moving towards 100% renewable energy future sooner rather than later. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the exchange.
Thank you, Sam, also. Now it's time for you for questions and answers. And we also have the possibility for people that are online connected. So we have a very small room, but we have a lot of people online connected. So I will take one question each, first from the floor, then online, and then back to the floor. So please introduce yourself and ask your question.
I'm Erika Desario from Carbon Pulse. So I have two questions. One will touch upon a topic that has been mentioned quite a few times already, which is the LDC issue and how to make the measure more acceptable also by the least developed countries. And my point was exactly the one that was mentioned by the last speaker. So whether it is possible to use the CBAM revenues either entirely or at least partially to support the modernization of the least developed countries. Also, so to use it also as a carrot, not simply as a stick, as it is currently perceived right now by some countries, Mozambique first. Second question is also about the potential exemptions that I understand are also partially mentioned in the current proposal of the Commission, so they're not clarified. And I wanted to understand what are the exemptions, because I see there is something for the Balkan countries in case they fulfill some requirements until 2030. Especially for the electricity sector. So for the first question, I wanted to understand what was the position of the Parliament and the Commission. Thank you.
Okay. Now, the problem is that Vice President Timmermans had to go to the plenary, so he couldn't stay. He can't answer the question. Is anyone around from the Commission's team so that we can get the answer? No, that's not. Then maybe I will try. And I have the privilege that we just talked this morning with the rapporteur. You know, I'm the rapporteur on the ETS, so I have this corresponding part of the free allowances and things connected there. Mohammed Shahim is a rapporteur on CBAM. He can't be with us, but we are looking at this in a very open and positive way. So I could imagine that the Parliament would go for an amendment asking part of the revenues, not all of the revenues, but part of the revenues to go for the decarbonization of least developed countries. I think that's something that's coming up in the Parliament. We have not voted on it. We are in an early stage of debate, but I think also personally this is a logical thing to do. Second part would definitely be to the European Commission, so I cannot answer. I see the challenge, but I don't have a solution now, especially because, you know, if Franz Timmermans mentioned Turkey has ratified the protocol because they are afraid of CBAM, but it's obvious to me that it is not enough to ratify the protocol. You have also to put ambition and to put some regulation, preferably a carbon price, to your own industry. And Turkey is a big issue because it's very close to Europe. We have a common border with Greece. So there will be a big issue of carbon leakage if they don't deliver more than just ratifying the protocol. Anyone else wants to come in on this question? Sam.
Just to add quickly on the dynamics with Turkey, I believe, and I spoke on a discussion earlier this week in the Turkish pavilion. I believe those efforts are underway, and interesting to see is that from the business and industry sector in the Turkish context, for example, they're not. It doesn't seem to concern everybody so much because some of those industries have had new investments in recent years. Cement sector, parts of those are operating more efficiently, are less polluting than the way we do it in Europe, thereby, I mean, this can create exactly that race which we were talking about, and so there may be a notion. Well, let's accept this and let's use this as an advantage to our industries moving forward. And this was the race I was talking about earlier. So I think that's encouraging. Yeah.
Thank you for that comment also. So I don't see any questions online yet. Those that are connected online should use the Slido, so you are invited. But we have questions here from the floor, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Regina Betz from Zurich University of Applied Sciences. I must confess I came in a little bit late, so I'm not sure if you have discussed it, but my question goes also in the direction of revenue use, and you were talking about allocations, moving more into auctions, less free allocations, so there will be revenue coming. And when we think about decarbonizing some of these sectors which are going to be under CBAM, like cement, chemical sector, and so on, they need CCS, and that will need infrastructure investments with regard to pipelines and so on. So my question is, the part which doesn't go to least developed countries or anywhere else, are you thinking of putting money on the table to help finance this infrastructure, or how is it envisaged that they are going to build pipelines for CO2?
Yeah, I can answer this question, and if any of the speakers wants to add. The idea that is presented by the European Commission, and here again we have the connection with the report of Mohammed Shahim on CBAM and my report on the ETS, is that all those free allowances that will not be given to the industry because they are protected by CBAM, and it will be a step-by-step process. Each year, less free allowances, more protection by CBAM. CBAM will slowly kick in and the free allowances will slowly go out. All the free allowances are not giving to the member states to do whatever they want. They are all going to the Innovation Fund. And this Innovation Fund is exactly for what you have mentioned, among others, to decarbonize industry and also to decarbonize with the help of CCS and CCU. So it's explicitly mentioned in the Commission proposal. What is missing, to my personal view, and I guess to the view of the Parliament, is a link to least developed countries. So that is something we need to amend. But the idea that it's not for the European Union to spend somewhere and to do whatever they want for the member states, no, it's on purpose for decarbonizing these sectors. Who else wants to come in? Sam.
Just to stress that I think this is a really interesting example because it puts a price on pollution and it smartly reinvests the revenues into further decarbonization. And the Innovation Fund, which was mentioned, tackles the power sector, but it also tackles hard-to-abate sectors, steel, chemicals, and cement. And to us, this is a much more productive way forward than exempting the sectors from the price signal by handing out these free emission allowances. Regrettably, I would say it does not seem that the majority of the European heavy industry sectors has grasped that measure, that concept yet. We see them still maintaining a position which would allow them to continue to pollute for free up to 2030, even beyond. Whereas I think there is a real benefit in it for them as well. If moving to auctions and smartly reinvesting that, including in those sectors, including the support for developing countries, that's the more constructive thing to do, I think.
Yeah, now we have two questions, in fact, from those that are online connected. I would read them out both, and then our experts can answer. Unfortunately, both are from Anonymous, so we always like if you also put your name and your background, but I read them out. How do you think you can deliver 55 or even 65 ambition in relation to pushing BECCS, increasing woody biomass burning, and decreasing land sinks, in brackets LULUCF? The second question, how do we address, in brackets, in a WTO compatible way, the issue of exports that are not covered by CBAM in third markets? Yeah, especially the second question, very relevant. Who wants to come in?
We're discussing how to have sort of burden sharing on the questions, and I suggested I would answer the second one because I am a lawyer and I know a little bit about WTO law. This is indeed probably one of the 4 or 5 most contentious issues in the debate about the CBAM, and one of the major headaches, let's say, for the heavy industry, where Sam correctly pointed out that there's now a lot of concern on how effective CBAM will protect industry against leakage compared to sort of earlier theoretical assumptions now that they have a proposal. And exempting or somehow rebating exports through a CBAM is indeed very, very difficult, if at all possible, to do in a way that is compatible with WTO law, specifically with the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures under the WTO. Because it is the EU ETS that is being adjusted for with the CBAM and not a tax, there is no provision within the ASCM, this agreement I just mentioned, that would allow rebating as exports leave the European customs territory, rebating any taxes that they pay domestically. That is done concurrently all the time with VAT, sales taxes, excise taxes, but not with regulatory measures like an ETS. In the Brussels discussion, there have been some memorandums, some legal analysis by law firms that suggest that it can be done in a legally compatible way. I have only seen summaries because I have not had access yet to the full analysis. And I'm not convinced. I have to say, I think it's better to be honest and realistic. They make some pretty far assumptions that many conventional trade lawyers, I think, would say will not stand in front of the WTO. Of course, they have to say that they're convinced that it will prevail. But I think, that's because that is the argument that they're making for their clients. I think what we will see is use of other instruments, and even these have to be designed very carefully so it does not seem to become a prohibited export subsidy, such as use of funds into innovation, for instance, discussions about carbon contracts for difference and other issues. And I think this will be a very fruitful and important discussion in the next few months as we have the debate about CBAM.
Sam, please.
The question related to biomass and land use things, Lulusiev's sector, important to keep in mind that currently any biomass burned under the European emissions trading system, so for example, a power plant burning coal but co-firing some wood pellets, all the biomass emissions are accounted as zero. So this creates a loophole in the sense that there is no full life cycle accounting of those emissions, as the EU basically considers them to be carbon neutral at the point of use under the EU ETS. We believe that's something that can be strengthened, that needs to be corrected. Also in the context of the Renewable Energy Directive, one of the other pieces of legislation which is open for improvement in the coming months. Second aspect is that to some extent land use sinks are already counted towards the 55% target. Many NGOs had warned against this kind of undermining the overall target through the back door because it was not part of the way the 40% emission reduction target was designed earlier. We believe it would be smarter and clearer to have separate accounting there, separate targets, so that you're not mixing up emission reductions with land use things. The same goes for the aspect of the BECS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which is mentioned in the question, which can theoretically remove CO2 emissions from the atmosphere, but we don't think that should be leading to allowing other sectors to start to emit more, because then it's again a zero-sum game.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't know if Mrs. Ströge also wants to come in.
Yes, she does.
Yes, please.
I wondered how to.
I didn't get the signal, so.
Yeah, I just
please.
Here I am. Yes, I would like to add to what Michael Milling has said. I mean, let's be clear. The risk of retaliation is immediate if you come into the if you're suspicious, if other countries are suspicious that you're subsidizing your exports. So the point really is that the other countries can take action immediately and not, file a case, and then it takes years to sort it out. So the risk is already there because we have a parallel system in the proposal that free allocation and the CBAM will come in parallel. And then, of course, the proof is needed that there's no double pricing or overpricing of the imports. But then again, this period of more than 12 years buys the time to see what is happening actually to export competition for EU producers. I see the risks, of course, of export leakage, but Michael has mentioned the tools that are at hand, and it is a moving target, because if other countries also our trade partners increase the carbon price, if they decarbonize more than right now, there's a chance to sort this out on the go. But I also think that the CBAM needs a revision also in this respect. Supporting decarbonization will deliver on this risk of export leakage, but it won't come across the, won't happen immediately. You know, you trigger the CBAM, but of course you cannot solve immediately the export problem. So that is, the good news is we have 12 years to sort this out and have another look at it. And that's, I think, is important to keep in mind.
Thank you for that. I will now have the last round of questions. Two are in the Slido and one is from the floor. Please start from the floor.
Hello, is it working? Yeah. My name is Ulises. I'm here a consultant in Guidehouse. And I would just like to ask, what is the external scope of both CBAM and the EU ETS to help other countries to accept these both measures? And what is the role specifically of parliaments, maybe in those interactions, as well as how to ensure societal buy-in? Because in the end, it's the parliaments who probably need to ratify, and they are representing their constituencies, who might be citizens that might not necessarily see these constituencies as, these measures as positive in their lives. So that would be my question.
Thank you for that question. I read out the two additional questions online. From Anonymous again, is there any legal justification for using 50% of revenues from the shipping route between outside the EU ports as EU budget? Important question. In the end, maybe I also comment on that one. And then from Daniela Rongchava, hello. Could be please defined a minimum safe height of price for carbon, but also for all types of emissions? Thank you. So who wants to come in? We have 5 minutes left. I think a final statement also from all speakers is welcome. Maybe starting with Sam.
Yes, I'll take your question here first on the signal to give and what the European Parliament can do. I alluded to the aspect of having more of a consideration of fairness and equity in the CBAM proposal. To me, that would really help to be able to not only create visibility for this measure, but also to ensure that it is understood as something where the European Union is sincere about ensuring that carbon emissions are not only decreasing inside its own territory, but that it can gain support for similar measures from the rest of the world. So this is, to some extent, and this is something where the European Parliament can strengthen the proposal. Second question on the height of the carbon price. There are various assumptions out there, but looking at the European emissions trading system, when it starts to make sense is when the power sector starts to switch from using coal as an energy source to using gas. And the levels have been varying, especially now that natural gas prices are relatively high. Even a 60 euro per ton carbon price is not enough to do that. A year ago, the situation was different, and running gas was more profitable than running coal. We're not there now, unfortunately. This points to the need to still make sure that the system doesn't backslide, that no new oversupply comes to the market, especially as coal phase out, and referring to the debates which take place in the German context already, as coal plants are closed down, and they should close down up to 2030 preferably. And I'll leave you to comment on the shipping question, please.
But first, Michael and Susanne Drügge.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I'll start with the last question by Daniela Ronchava. So there are, of course, integrated assessment models that, for instance, model out how we get to net zero emissions by 2050, will project a global carbon price to achieve that. the high-level commission on carbon pricing suggested we need 50 to 70 euros or 50 to 80 euros over this decade globally. International Monetary Fund has come out with figures. I would caution against taking any such figure because I think we also have to acknowledge the EU will have to have a higher price than, say, sub-Saharan Africa. And there will be equity considerations about what the appropriate carbon price is, inevitably. But I think we all know that. I just wanted to make sure it's in there. On the other question brought in here in person about parliaments, so I think it's a very, very powerful tool if legislators can talk to each other directly. Of course, foreign relations tends to be in the hands of the executive, foreign ministries, the External Action Service, etc. But there are these legislator-to-legislator exchanges. And I spoke with some of the congressional delegation members of the Republican Party that were here in Glasgow earlier this week. And, you know, unsurprisingly, that's not the most robust channel there is. I think typically many of the legislators in the EU will talk to Democratic counterparts because there's more interest, there's more, let's say, fertile starting points there. But I think that's all the more critical to have these conversations, especially with the ones that already come expecting pushback, expecting skepticism and being booed out, that there are actually people they can talk to when they're ready to move forward. It's always going to remain a difficult relationship given how far apart the politics are, but I encourage especially that channel because they will be in power again at some point.
Yeah, thank you for also this last sentence because it's always important to be realistic. Susanne Dröge, for your final statement also and the questions.
Yes, maybe very briefly, most has been answered, but I think when it comes to the earmarking of the revenues, we are in this internal discussion within the EU legislative process in terms of the pandemic and next generation EU programs that try to bolster the effects from this crisis. It is, of course, also a tough internal fight to bring through these earmarks. And we've just heard that the idea is being brought forward by the EP, which is a good idea to earmark also the CBAM revenues for international purposes. Let's see how we get there and how to make this happen on the ground, and also making this part of our communication with partners, that the EU is guaranteeing help that materializes in decarbonization. And I would leave it at this point because time is up. And I thank you again for inviting me to this very interesting exchange.
Thank you very much. So that concludes our meeting, but I would also add to the questions that were raised. First of all, is it legitimate that the European Union member states will get 50% of the revenues from international trips? I think it's a fair offer. And that's why I repeat, it's an invitation to the world. So if China would establish a similar scheme, or the United States, they have the other 50%. So we don't take 100%, we take 50%. Because we think it's necessary to regulate and it's necessary to invest the revenues in technology, also in shipping. So I think that's a fair offer to the world, and everybody who is serious on decarbonization should follow us and do the same. On the carbon price, you know, we think the market should create the price in the end. And the target that we all have is in Europe minus 55%. We think, as my political group, we think it is ambitious. We support the Commission here. And it's our bid for going to the Paris Agreement. And that will determine the price. But I also agree with the one that raised the question that it should be for all parts of the economy. And that's why that is not so much an international issue, but it's a decarbonization issue. We don't have a carbon price on transport and on buildings. And that's a problem, because in the electricity, the decarbonization is very successful. We have made it now. The carbon price is high enough to switch from coal to gas already. And in other areas, we are not successful. In the transport area, emissions are not going down in most European member states. That's why I support, also as a rapporteur, the proposal that Mr. Timmermans made on the carbon price also in the other areas. But to wrap up our discussion, I think it's very important to discuss and to cooperate. we in the European Union should make clear that we don't want unlegitimate support of our industry. We want to decarbonize the industry. And I can tell you, Sam was a bit pessimistic, but I met a lot of industry stakeholders that now got the message. They said, we have a plan to decarbonize. We want to do it, but if we do it without anyone else doing it, we will lose the market share, and the cement and the steel will come from wherever, and we will not be able to compete. So that's the point. We are really determined to decarbonize our industry, but at the same time, we don't want to deindustrialize Europe, because that would not be the good example for the rest of the world. And we are not perfect. The proposal is not good enough. That's why we are working in the European Parliament. But please be a messenger, be an envoy for this message in your respective countries, and let's cooperate. Thank you very much.